The dust rolled across the frontier like it had been waiting there all summer, and the late afternoon sun hammered down on the platform until the air turned shimmery and brutal. Caleb Hart stood with his arms crossed and one boot propped on the station rail while he watched the horizon for any sign of movement. He had cleaned his cabin twice that morning, even though he wasn't the kind of man who usually bothered with such things, but the nerves were starting to get the better of him. The stagecoach finally appeared through the heat haze as a blurry shape before the noise took over, bringing the sound of grinding wheels and snorting horses as the driver's curses cut through the wind. It lurched to a stop in a cloud of red dust so thick that Caleb had to squint just to see the door, which eventually swung open to reveal his future. A woman stepped out wearing a kimono that had clearly taken the long journey hard, with travel-worn fabric and red dust coating the edges of the silk. Her jet-black hair was pinned in a traditional knot like the ones Caleb had only seen in old newspapers, and her dark eyes scanned the platform as if she were counting every possible exit. She had a slight build and fair skin, but there was something in the way she moved that suggested she was made of steel rather than porcelain. What stopped Caleb's heart was her right hand, because she was holding a wooden practice sword with the kind of ease that only comes from years of daily use. Caleb's face went completely blank as he realized this wasn't at all what he had ordered from the catalog. Caleb Hart had built his ranch with nothing but his own 2 hands, and it took him 9 long years to clear the land and finish the cabin. Those years of work moved him from sunrise to sundown, with barely enough energy left to eat. But he didn't build the place for anyone else. He did it because the physical labor was easier than thinking about the past, and the horses were the only ones he really talked to. They listened without any judgment and never asked him to explain the choices he'd made, which was exactly how he liked it. People were a different story, because they always expected a certain kind of softness that Caleb just didn't have anymore. They wanted conversation over dinner and warmth at night, but Caleb had learned early on that isolation was much cleaner than the sting of disappointment. You couldn't fail anyone if you didn't let them get close, so he kept his world small and his fences high. That changed during the winter of his 8th year alone, when he woke up and realized the silence in the house wasn't peaceful anymore. The quiet had started to develop teeth, and the empty cabin felt less like a sanctuary and more like a cage he had built for himself, and then locked from the inside. He wasn't the type to sit around and feel sorry for himself, so he decided to take action the only way he knew how. The mail-order bride service operated out of St. Louis, and placed ads in the back of newspapers for women from Japan and Eastern Europe who were looking for good men. Caleb sent a letter describing the ranch and his modest income, but he didn't promise any romance or grand gestures. He promised stability and a roof that didn't leak. And 3 months later, he received a reply that Sora Tanaka would be arriving on the 14th. Caleb read that letter 50 times until the paper was soft, focusing on the words that promised she was skilled in household management and obedient. He wanted someone who could make the cabin feel like a real home, and the word obedient was the part that finally settled the anxiety in his chest. He didn't want a woman who would challenge him or expect things he couldn't give, so he viewed the whole thing as a simple transaction where both sides got what they needed. The night before she arrived, he scrubbed the kitchen table until his hands burned and stood in the bedroom trying to imagine what it would feel like to share his life. He was nervous in a way he hadn't been since he was a boy, and he spent his time at the platform rehearsing words that felt wooden and fake in his mouth. He was prepared for a quiet, traditional wife, but the woman who stepped off that stagecoach was nothing like the person he had imagined. Sora stepped down from the stagecoach with her wooden sword, the bokken, gripped loosely at her side. She trailed one hand along the frame for balance as she reached the dirt, but her eyes didn't show the relief you'd expect from a traveler finishing a long haul. Instead, she scanned the platform with a cold, methodical focus, as if she were counting every possible obstacle in her path. She wasn't just looking around, she was cataloging the world and assessing everything in it. Caleb stepped forward because that was the decent thing to do when a woman arrived alone. He reached out his hand in the traditional Western way, palm open and welcoming. But his chest felt tight with a sudden, unexplainable pressure. Sora didn't take his hand, and instead she bowed deeply from the waist in a movement so controlled it looked like a rehearsed ritual. Her hand never let go of the wooden sword, and the bow wasn't the shy gesture of someone unsure of herself. It was formal and deliberate, the kind of movement that only comes from years of training rather than simple instinct. When she finally straightened up, her eyes locked onto his without a hint of hesitation. "The journey was long," she said, and while her English carried a heavy accent, the words were clear and solid. "I need water, and I need to know if you have a place where I can practice." She didn't ask for a place to rest or a spot to unpack her things. She asked for a place to practice. Caleb gestured toward his horse and wagon because he didn't trust his own voice to stay steady. As they began loading her single leather trunk, he caught a glimpse of her hands and realized they weren't what he expected. Calluses covered her palms and knuckles, and small white scars ran across her skin like a map of old injuries. The veins in her wrists were prominent and strong, which told him these weren't hands that spent their days over a cook stove or scrubbing laundry. These were hands that had been forged by a completely different kind of labor. The way she moved only made that more obvious because there was no wasted motion or uncertainty in her steps. When she grabbed her end of the heavy trunk, her entire body moved as one single unit, showing a level of coordination that spoke of deep discipline. Most women Caleb had known moved with a certain hesitance, as if they were worried about taking up too much space in the world. Sora moved like she knew exactly what her body was capable of, and she clearly wasn't going to apologize to anyone for it. The ride back to the ranch took about an hour, and she spent the whole time sitting rigid on the wagon bench. She kept the bakken resting across her lap like a child she was sworn to protect, so Caleb tried to start some small talk just to break the heavy silence. "Was it a long journey from Japan?" he asked, hoping for a real conversation. "Yes," she replied, but she didn't offer anything else until she added, "I left because I had to leave." He asked her name even though he'd seen it in the letters, and she corrected his pronunciation to Sora before turning her gaze back to the horizon. The ranch eventually came into view, starting with the fence line and the barn before the cabin itself appeared. It was a modest place that showed the practical work of a man living alone, with no thought given to how things looked or how comfortable they were. She studied the buildings the same way she'd studied the train platform, as if she were measuring the angles and distances for a plan he couldn't see. Inside, he walked her through each room one by one, showing her the bedroom where he'd aired out the blankets and the kitchen stocked with basic supplies. He'd spent days preparing everything and imagining she would nod with gratitude or at least see the effort he'd put in. She gave a small nod at every room, but her face never softened, and there was no sign that she found this place any better than the life she'd left behind. Once the tour was over, she turned back to him and asked the same question again. "Where can I practice?" In that moment, Caleb realized he had absolutely no idea who he had actually invited to live in his home. He led her out to the barn because he honestly didn't know where else to take her. In his mind, he figured practice meant some kind of quiet domestic skill, like sewing or preparing food that she wanted to keep sharp. Sora set her trunk against the rough wooden wall and walked straight to the center of the floor, where the afternoon light was streaming through the gaps in the boards. She stood in the middle of the dust motes and gripped the bokken with both hands, her feet set firmly at shoulder width. Her breathing changed right then, becoming deep and deliberate. Then she started to move. The first few strikes were slow and measured as she drew the wooden sword in a perfectly controlled arc. Her feet never left the ground with the clumsy jerking motions of a beginner, but instead they glided across the dirt with her weight perfectly balanced. Her breathing sounded almost like a meditation, moving in through her nose and out through her mouth in total sync with her body. But then the speed started to pick up. It was gradual at first, but soon the boken was cutting through the air with a sound like a hard wind rushing through a stone canyon. It wasn't a whistle or a sharp crack, but a heavy rushing sound that proved she was using immense force and perfect control at the same time. Every strike flowed into the next one without a single pause or a moment of doubt about where the sword should go. The movements were linked together like running water, and there were no seams between one gesture and the next. Caleb stood in the doorway with his hand frozen on the frame, unable to look away as the world shifted beneath his feet. The woman he'd expected to cook his meals and be grateful for a roof was clearly a trained warrior. The precision of her strikes and the way her breathing stayed steady told him this was the result of decades of work. This wasn't a hobby she'd picked up, but a discipline that was embedded into her very bones. After 20 minutes of this, she simply stopped mid-motion and lowered the sword to her side. She wasn't winded or gasping for air, and when she turned to face him, her eyes finally showed a flicker of acknowledgement. She recognized that he had seen what she was capable of. "I was trained in Bushido," she told him, "which is the way of the warrior, and back in Japan, I was the daughter of a sword master." Caleb's throat felt tight, and he couldn't find a single word to say in response to that. Sora kept talking as if he'd asked for the whole story, explaining that her father had died 3 years ago. Her family had tried to force her into a marriage with a wealthy man who wanted to buy her obedience along with her family name. She paused for a second before saying, "So I left." The mail-order bride service wasn't an act of desperation for her, but a calculated exit strategy from a life she refused to lead. She had paid for her own passage and created a new identity, arriving in America expecting to find a man who wouldn't know any better. She wanted someone isolated and relieved enough to avoid asking difficult questions, a man who just wanted a wife who wouldn't challenge his authority. "I can still cook and clean for you," she said while holding the boken, "and I know Campo, which is our traditional medicine, so I'm not useless." "I never thought you were," Caleb said, though they both knew it was a lie because he'd imagined someone much simpler and more submissive. Sora placed the boken against the barn wall with incredible care, treating the wood as if it were something sacred. Then she turned back to him. "I need to know what you really want from me, and I want the real answer, not what you wrote in the letters. What do you actually want?" Caleb realized right then that he didn't have an answer ready, because the deal he'd imagined was already dead. He was standing in front of a woman who had walked away from her entire world rather than let someone else control her. She was a woman who could likely kill him with a piece of wood if she ever felt the need. "I want to know who you actually are," he finally admitted. Sora's expression changed, and while she didn't exactly soften, there was a look of recognition in her eyes. "That is going to take a long time," she said, "and it is going to require trust, so I need to know if you understand what that really means." Dinner existed in the kitchen like a test neither of them had studied for, and the air felt heavy with the things they weren't saying. Sora moved through the small space with movements so precise they looked like measurements, finding the rice he kept in a tin and the dried vegetables stored in a cloth bag. She filled a pot with water from the pump and set it over the fire without asking where a single thing was, her hands working independently from her face. She was efficient and certain in her tasks, while her eyes never quite rose to meet his. The meal she prepared smelled like nothing from his life, a broth filled with ingredients he couldn't name, and rice cooked to a specific texture that was neither mushy nor crunchy. The vegetables weren't boiled into submission, but kept their own texture and taste. And as he ate, the knot in his chest that had been wound tight since the platform began to loosen slightly. It was better than good, yet he couldn't fully enjoy it because the weight of the day sat in his stomach alongside the food. They ate in a silence that had its own physical weight, making him hyper-aware of every sound he made as he chewed louder than normal. Sora had produced her own chopsticks from somewhere, rather than asking for a fork, and she moved the utensils with the same precision she applied to everything else. He found himself watching her hands instead of his plate, and finally, because the quiet was becoming suffocating, he asked how long she planned to stay. Sora set her chopsticks down across the lip of her bowl with a deliberate gesture that signaled she was finished. She told him the service had promised him a bride, while she had promised herself a place to disappear, and she admitted those two things might not align. When he leaned forward to ask what if they could, she studied him across the table in a way that made him feel like she was still assessing his character. She told him he would need to understand she wasn't a bride, but a woman who arrived on a stagecoach with a wooden sword because she had nowhere else to go. Caleb nodded slowly, feeling like each motion was important and that his answer was written in his body's language. And he told her he could accept that. After dinner, she retreated to the bedroom without ceremony or a good night, simply moving through the doorway and closing it quietly behind her. Caleb sat by the fire as the weight of the day pressed down on him until the chair seemed to hold him in place. Through the thin walls of the cabin, he heard the soft scrape of wood on wood and realized she was practicing with the bokken in the dark. Her muscle memory kept her grounded as her body found the shapes her mind had trained it to hold. And he understood then that she wasn't running towards safety or a new life. She was running away from her family and the man they'd chosen, and that running wouldn't stop just because she'd arrived at a cabin in the middle of nowhere. 3 days settled into a rhythm that felt less like living and more like observing yourself live from a distance. Sora moved through the cabin with movements stripped down to their essence, wasting nothing and softening nothing as she cooked without fanfare. The garden Caleb had neglected for years suddenly had rows because she'd cleared the weeds and turned the soil to plant things he didn't recognize. Everything she did carried that same focus she brought to the bokken in the barn at dawn, whether she was hanging laundry or mending a hole in his coat. Caleb found himself watching her more than was reasonable, the way you'd watch someone learning a language you didn't speak. There was a clear logic to her actions, but that logic felt foreign to him. So he worked the ranch harder than he had in months to stay away from the cabin during the day. He gave the horses extra attention and made unnecessary repairs to the fence line, exhausting himself on purpose in hopes that a bone-deep tiredness would simplify his life again. On the 4th day, Tom Harding rode up to the house, and he was exactly the kind of neighbor who appeared when you least wanted to see him. Tom always wrapped his good intentions around the assumption that everyone's life was open for his commentary, and he'd likely ridden over to welcome the bride with a mix of frontier hospitality and cruelty. He dismounted near the garden where Sora was digging, but she didn't look up as he approached, which was the first thing that seemed to bother him. Tom called out that she must be the bride in a voice that was far too loud for the distance between them. Sora set her shovel down and straightened to face him fully. And that was when Tom seemed to realize his expectations weren't going to be met. She introduced herself as Sora and identified him as the neighbor, but Tom just laughed that dismissive laugh designed to put a person in their place. He told her he bet she didn't speak much English, and said Caleb probably preferred it that way to keep things simple. What happened next occurred in a single motion, as Sora's hand moved to the bokken she'd left leaning against the fence post. She drew the wooden sword and held it horizontally across her body at chest height, and while it wasn't a threat stated in words, it certainly wasn't a greeting. She told him she spoke English well enough to understand his insult, and Tom's expression hardened as his hand went toward his pistol on pure instinct. Caleb appeared from the barn, moving faster than Tom expected, and told his neighbor not to do it. The authority in Caleb's voice wasn't a suggestion, but a line drawn in the dirt, and Tom looked between the two of them as he realized she wasn't just a bride. Caleb confirmed that she wasn't, and Tom mounted his horse with his pride visibly bleeding, warning Caleb that he was making a mistake because she was trouble. As the neighbor rode away, Sora lowered the bokken and returned to her garden. And when Caleb offered his thanks, she didn't stop digging. She told him she wasn't defending him, but was defending herself, even if the result was the same. A week had passed since their talk, and the territory around the ranch seemed smaller somehow, almost as if Sora's presence had redrawn the boundaries of everything Caleb considered his own. On an afternoon when the heat sat thick and still over the valley, he walked toward the barn, needing supplies like rope or nails, mostly just looking for something to occupy his hands with practical work. He found her kneeling beside the leather trunk with the lid thrown back. She wasn't trying to hide what she was doing, and she didn't snap the lid shut or try to cover the items she'd been examining when he arrived. She simply looked up when his shadow crossed the doorway, and then returned to her task. Letters lay spread across the trunk's interior in neat bundles tied together with silk string, and a photograph sat on top, showing a man in traditional Japanese clothing with a stern face and eyes that carried the heavy weight of authority. Beneath the picture lay a wooden sword no bigger than a child's arm, with a surface worn smooth from decades of handling. There was also a journal with a leather cover creased from years of use, its pages jutting at odd angles where she had marked specific passages. This was the person Sora became when she thought no one was watching. Caleb sat down on a hay bale without being invited because he understood this was a moment she had decided to allow him to see. "My father," she said, holding up the photograph for him to look at. "Tanaka Kinji. He was a sword master and the best in our prefecture." The man in the image had her eyes, which were neither soft nor uncertain. "He trained me from the time I was a small child," Sora said, as she turned the photograph toward the light. "It wasn't because of tradition, or because he valued boys more, but because I was his only child, and he wanted me to be strong." She opened the journal carefully, her fingers finding a marked page without having to search for it. The handwriting on the paper was careful and deliberate, showing a child's precision applied to very adult thoughts. Beside the Japanese characters, Sora had written out a translation in English that read, "A woman with skill is a woman with choices. I will give my daughter that gift." The words seemed to hang in the dusty barn air between them. "When he died, my mother wanted me to forget all of this so I could become someone smaller," Sora continued. "She wanted me to be someone who could be folded into a marriage my family had already arranged." She picked up the child-sized bokken and cradled it like something fragile, even though the wood was clearly as hard as bone. "I was only 4 years old when I first held this, and he stood right behind me in the garden to guide my hands," she said. "He taught me that strength wasn't about size, but about knowing what you were capable of and refusing to apologize for it." The man her family had chosen for her existed only in Sora's refusal to meet him, and Caleb understood that much without her having to state it directly. "They wanted to marry me to someone from a powerful family, a man who would have bought my obedience along with my name," she explained. "He would have taken this bokken, the journal, and the letters and burned every bit of it." Caleb asked his next question very carefully. "Why did you choose to come here, to a stranger?" Sora closed the journal slowly, looking as if she were closing a door on something she had been carrying for a long time. "Because I needed to disappear, and America is far enough away that my family can't find me," she admitted. "I heard about men who wanted wives sight unseen, and I thought maybe one of them wouldn't care who I was before, or maybe he would be too isolated and relieved to ask questions." She met his eyes directly without blinking. "I regret that I lied to the service when I told them I was obedient and grateful, because the truth is, I am neither of those things." "Then what are you?" Caleb asked. "I am a woman who lost her father and refused to lose herself," Sora said. "I am someone who fights, and I am someone who will stay here only if I choose to stay, not because I have nowhere else to go." Caleb stood up from the hay bale. "Then choose. Don't do it out of desperation, but choose because you actually want to be here." Sora rose to face him. "That's not how this works, Caleb. You don't get to ask me to stay without knowing the cost." "Then tell me what the cost is," he said. "The cost is that I will never be the wife you ordered from a catalog," she told him. "I will be someone you have to earn respect from, someone who will leave if you prove yourself unworthy, and someone who will fight, literally fight, if you try to control me." Caleb didn't hesitate for a second. "I can live with that." Winter came early that year and arrived like something with teeth. The blizzard started 3 weeks after Sora opened her trunk, and the snow didn't stop falling for 5 days straight. It piled against the cabin walls until the windows became dark rectangles framing a world of white nothingness, and the wind screamed across the roof like an animal that knew they were inside and wanted to get in. Caleb had always loved the winter months because the isolation felt purposeful and necessary. The weather usually gave him permission to withdraw further and talk less, allowing him to exist in the quiet without it feeling like a personal failure. But Sora changed the mathematics of solitude entirely. Trapped inside the small cabin, there was nowhere left for them to go. There was no barn to escape to and no fence line to repair, which meant there was no distance between them at all. They shared every meal at the same small table and sat by the same fire, moving through the rooms in a careful dance of spacing as they each tried to occupy as little of the other's air as possible. The thinness of the cabin walls meant every sound carried, from her breathing at night to his own restlessness, and every moment of their existence was amplified by the close proximity. On the 4th day of the storm, something finally broke inside Caleb. It might have been the snow, or perhaps a hunger for something he couldn't quite name. "I don't know how to do this," he said, his words coming out rough and unpracticed. "I don't know how to be around you without wanting to ask you to stay, and I don't know if you'll ever actually choose to." Sora sat by the fire, mending a tear in his jacket with her needle moving in precise stitches that were each smaller than the last. She didn't look up from her work. "You're afraid," she said. "Yes." "Of what exactly?" "I'm afraid that you'll leave, and that this was all a mistake," he admitted. "I'm worried I brought someone into my home who will eventually realize she made a terrible choice." Sora set the needle and thread aside with great care, folding the jacket into a clean rectangle on her lap. "I could leave tomorrow, because I have money and I have skills," she said. "I could find work in any town willing to hire a Japanese woman who knows how to fight. But the fact is, I haven't left, and I won't." Caleb waited for the rest of the thought, looking for the condition or the reason that would make it bearable to hear. "It's not because I'm trapped, or because I have no other choice," she continued. "It's because something here is different." "What is it?" he asked. "You looked at me with the bokken in my hands, and you didn't see a problem that needed to be solved," she said. "You saw a person, and that is rare." She stood up and walked to the window, letting her hand rest on the frost-covered glass as if she could feel the freezing temperature through it. "In Japan, my father saw me as someone who needed to be strong, while my mother saw me as someone to be controlled," she explained. "The man my family chose would have seen me as something to be broken." She turned back to face him in the firelight. "You see me as someone I might actually want to become." Caleb crossed the room and reached for her hand, making the same gesture he had made on that train platform weeks ago. The first time he tried, she had refused him, but this time her fingers wrapped around his. Her hand was calloused, scarred, and completely certain. "Who do you want to become?" he asked. "I don't know yet. But I want to find out here with you if you can accept that I'm still figuring it out." "I can accept that," he said. The blizzard continued to rage outside the cabin walls, but something in the space between them had finally shifted. It wasn't love yet, and it wasn't certainty, but it was the beginning of something neither of them had ever ordered. The stagecoach dust settled into the dirt long ago, but Sora still heads out at dawn to practice, her wooden sword cutting through the morning air like a series of questions finally finding their answers. Caleb watches her from the porch sometimes, and he has stopped trying to solve the mystery of her past, choosing instead to simply accept that she stays because she wants to be there. The quiet mail-order bride he expected never actually showed up. What arrived instead was a woman who showed him that the strongest homes aren't built on someone following orders, but on two people earning each other's respect. Subscribe to see what happens when these two finally stop pretending to be who they thought they were supposed to be.